Meeting of the Windsor Heights City Council come to order. Roll call.
Susan Skerry.
Here.
Joseph Jones.
Here.
Mike Jones. Here. Teresa Harms.
Here.
And Michael Fredo.
Here. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Long advance with that.
I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Next item is approval of the agenda.
So moved. Second?
Roll call.
Susan Skerry.
Yes.
Joseph Jones.
Yes.
Michael Fredo. Yes. Mike Jones.
Yes.
And Teresa Harms.
Yes.
Next item is public forum. It's time set aside for comments from the public on topics of city business other than what's listed on the agenda. No action will be taken. Come to the podium, state your name and address. Please keep your comments no more than 5 minutes. Hearing and seeing none. Next item is approval of the consent agenda. Roll call.
Susan Skerry.
Yes.
Joseph Jones.
Yes.
Michael Fredo.
Yes.
Mike Jones.
Yes.
And Teresa Harms.
Yes.
Next item is acceptance of flood study.
Mr. Mayor, tonight is the culmination of a lot of work from JEO and some city staff on the flood resiliency analysis. Dan and John are here this evening, and hopefully they can come up to you and give you a few minutes kind of summarizing the end product that you have before you this evening. Staff understands that this is a complex issue, and there is more than just one evening's worth of discussion to be had. So by the end of this evening's discussion and Q&A of JEO, we're recommending that the council set this for a work session in the future to be discussed. I think we actually have a date certain in January on the 18th for this to be set as a work session. With that, Dan, John, if you could give the council a quick summary of the end product, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you very much. My name is John Callan, the JEO, and with me tonight is Dan Fricke, and also here with us is Chris Shires with Confluence, who is one of the sub-consultants for us on this project. So what I'm going to do is just give a quick overview of kind of what we've worked on and really focus mostly on the bottom line recommendations that we have for you, and then certainly answer any questions that you might have. Dan's going to hand out a few items. This first one is something you have in your packets already. It's just a larger format version of it, so hopefully it's a little bit easier to read. I will say that if you haven't checked it out already, the story map that we've got up on the screen here is very detailed. Obviously not going to hit nearly all of that information. There's a lot there. So certainly encourage you to check that out when you get a chance. If you give me just a minute, I'll kind of scroll through here. So I'm going to assume that you are all pretty familiar with the background and purpose of the project. But the basic version of it is that we want to take a look at where's the flood risk in Windsor Heights and what can be done to mitigate that risk. And there's kind of different ways to look at that mitigation. One way to look at it is to prevent flooding from occurring in certain areas. Another way is to look at it is to prevent the impacts of the flooding from occurring to the buildings in those areas. And then another way to kind of consider how we look at it is it about floodplain mapping and the impacts of that floodplain mapping, because that was one of the original reasons for the project to be thought about, was the change in the floodplain map and how it impacted the Colby Park neighborhood. Or is it about real world changes in the flood risk? So Dalton, I might need a hand Do you happen to have an external mouse for this? Show, yeah, there we go. Sorry, it's an unfamiliar computer for me there. So I'm gonna pretty much skip over the background. The only thing I wanna say is that we did do some additional flood modeling for this. And the purpose of that flood modeling was to establish a baseline for us to help determine for you, with all the recommendations that we look at, making sure that they're effective. And the reason we did this is because we used some technical tools that weren't available when the flood modeling was completed that's on the effective flood insurance rate maps. So, I think I'm good here, let's see. So, the other thing I wanted to show you that is kind of a critical part of our thought process on this project is this building by building flood risk assessment. One of the things that happened throughout the course of the project was we realized after we started looking at Colby Park flood risk and had the first public meeting that some of the residents in that live along North Walnut Creek just expressed an interest in having that be looked at a little more closely as well. So we expanded things a little bit, and we took our flood modeling and elevations of the buildings determined using terrain data to look at what buildings are most at risk, because the risk of the buildings impacts the recommendations we make, and it also impacts if those recommendations are cost effective. The higher the risk, the more frequently they get flooded, the more likely the recommendation will be cost effective. And so if you go to the story map and you check it out, you can see information on there about the depth of flooding for individual buildings. And this also guided our recommendations regarding where to take action. So when we looked at mitigation action assessment, like I said, we looked at several categories. Some are program and policy categories, such as stormwater management and joining the National Flood Insurance Program's community rating system. And all those things are directed at just sort of maintaining your program or improving the way you're doing floodplain and stormwater management today. And then really the sort of core of what we looked at was what's called non-structural and structural improvements. Structural improvements are things like channels and levees, upstream dams. Non-structural improvements are moving the consequences, changing the consequences at the building level. So retrofitting buildings to either elevate them or adapt them to flooding so that they aren't impacted when flooding enters the area where they are, rather than keeping the flooding away from the building. And I'm happy to talk about this in much more detail through questions, but as I go through here, I'm just going to focus on the recommendations that we found to be most important. And the two programmatic recommendations are things that we think the community should look at. The main reason being they're relatively easy to do, and they're just set the framework for how you go forward from here. The first one is joining the National Flood Insurance Program's community rating system. This is a voluntary program through the NFIP that provides discounts on flood insurance. And we think that you could get a discount on flood insurance for the residents of the community of up to around $11,000 a year to start. That number is based on certain assumptions about where you would land in this program. That they have different classifications that determine your discount and the amount of coverage that you currently have in the community in terms of flood insurance. The other one I think is a really important one. It's something you're already doing, and that is working with the surrounding communities to manage stormwater to maintain existing conditions and not make the flood risk worse. Kind of a subcategory of this is looking at upstream flood storage opportunities. Clive is doing that. Other communities in the region of Polk County are also doing that. And Windsor Heights is kind of a partner to those discussions, and, you know, whether you participate financially or not is to be determined. But it's just a thing where we definitely recommend continuing that, continue to promote your role in those discussions and determining whether they're cost beneficial to you. We didn't really look at upstream flood storage as closely as we originally intended through this project, and the main reason is that those opportunities are kind of a case-by-case deal. We're actually looking at one now that Polk County's working on, and the character and purpose of those efforts vary a lot. And so since there's already ongoing efforts, it didn't really make sense for us to look at that too closely. We kind of used that time to focus on North Walnut Creek instead. So getting into the non-structural and structural actions that we looked at. And one thing I'd also note is that we ran all of this by the Public Works Committee in a lot of detail. So there's recommendations that I'll get to as far as what we think you should do moving forward, excuse me, is based on those discussions as well. So to give you a sense of what these actions are, retrofitting actions, and on the screen here, it's hard to see on that one, but there's different action types, and I'll just zoom in here a little bit. And these represent things such as, I'll focus on North Walnut Creek because this is one of our recommendations.
Can you zoom in on the white part?
This part here?
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not able to zoom on that part. I can tell you what they say though. This symbol is a flood barrier type action. These are no action because they're actually elevated above the flooding already. And here is elevation. And those recommendations or potential actions all have they're based on factors such as the building elevation, photos of the building, the flood elevation relative to the building, and just construction, building construction type and feasibility. They all have actually an individual cost associated with them, though the costs we report here on the story map are aggregated. But we wanted to look at this to compare to, for example, which is I'll get to in a second here, if you put a levee in Colby Park, does that provide comparatively more benefit for the cost? And one of the things that we found in terms of general non-structural retrofitting actions is that this area of North Walnut Creek, these particular properties, because of the way they're built, they have potentially frequent flood risk, and the retrofitting actions are cheaper for the same flood risk reduction than, say, building a flood wall, which is one of the structural actions with bigger, more robust actions that we
Can I ask a
identified
question?
there.
Because
Yeah.
the map, I can't read it obviously. but
Sure.
The cross streets are what were you pointing to up there?
So
In
this
Windsor
is
Heights, what are the cross streets?
73rd and Sunset right here,
Okay. So 73rd and okay,
Colby Avenue here.
okay. I just wanted to see how far north it was.
So we looked at those alternatives for both neighborhoods. And I'll talk a little bit at the end here about what we recommend coming out of that. We also looked at acquisitions, essentially what would it cost to do that for both the North Walnut Creek neighborhood and the Colby Park neighborhood. When you're looking at something like this comprehensively, you kind of inherently have to look at something like that as an option. Here's an example of what an individual property flood barrier might look like. This isn't, this is something that could vary depending on the design and the individual property owner interest.
How much would that cost a property owner?
So typical per property cost is probably in the range of 25 to 50,000. But these particular projects are very cost beneficial and likely to be cost beneficial for a grant application, which would mean that the cost share for an individual property owner at most would be 25% of that number.
That's pretty good.
So I'm actually gonna skip over a couple here just because they're not on our ultimate recommendations. The other thing we looked at, getting to structural projects is different versions of possible levee alignments. And all of these are focused around the Colby Park neighborhood. This levee alignment A is basically just connecting the ground from Walmart to the interstate, close that gap to prevent flooding from entering the park. This is the one that we also focused on for further cost benefit analysis. The reason we did that is because it is the lowest cost alternative to get this risk reduction in this way. We did look at some other levee alternatives, and I won't go into the weeds on those unless you have questions. But the reason that we did this, you notice in the last figure, you still see the floodplain over the park. And the reason we show it that way is because when it comes to floodplain map changes, FEMA requires certain height criteria to be met. It's called levee accreditation. In that configuration, it doesn't meet those criteria. So it still provides risk reduction, but it doesn't change the floodplain map. This levee alignment, B1 and B2 alternatives, and C1 and C2, you notice they tie back at different locations than levee alignment A, which was just over here. And the reason for that is specifically so that they could be accredited and change the floodplain map if they were built. But unfortunately, that carries not only additional cost, but additional property impact because you need properties moved or removed in order to build it that way. And levee alignment C, same thing, except we've got it set back here. And the reason we did it that way is to allow the park to still, basically the flood storage in the park to still be maintained, because in the other configurations, we actually have impacts on the other side of the stream because of closing that off. So it just mitigates those impacts. And the final structural alternative I want to talk about is channel modification. And this project is one that we are recommending looking at in more detail, and I'll explain that further in a minute. But the reason for that is that this kind of gives you a little bit the best of both worlds in the sense that it doesn't cause impacts to the 3E building. It actually provides benefits to 3E and all these businesses on this side of the channel. It does provide a lot of benefit to this part of the neighborhood, although it doesn't eliminate flooding completely. And also, I do want to point out just some history on this as well. So this part of the channel was actually improved back in the 90s. But the way we looked at it so far is we're just recommending looking at essentially doing the same type of improvement for this part of the reach. In a minute, when we kind of talk about the overall summary of the recommendations, we talk about maybe some of the next steps and what that looks like as far as funding and how you might go about that in a way that promotes the possibility of funding.
Ask a question.
Yeah.
Aren't the experts predicting that flooding risk will get greater and greater as we go on?
So,
I mean, there used to be a 100-year flood.
yeah,
And then it seems to be that they're being,
so, yes, so there are a couple considerations there. You have urbanization, flooding, which is just a change in land use that influences how much runoff occurs. One of the key recommendation of stormwater management practices is intended to prevent that from occurring. So the other element that comes into that discussion is climate change and the state of the science on that as far as intensification of rainstorms is being looked at by, I didn't mention in the background, but Clive has worked with the Corps of Engineers through what's called the Iowa Silver Jackets team to do a project to look at certain H&H modeling or flood risk modeling for the region. And the phase 2 of that project is looking at climate change, and that's not available to us yet to consider. So all that being said, it is an important consideration. For the time being, the project recommendations have just been based on existing conditions, flood risk. Mainly just to pick something and to be understandable. So when you look at, if you take a next step on a project, we definitely recommend that you consider the possibility of future conditions as part of the design process with a discussion about how you're gonna do that. I also think it's very important to continue to look at and work with the communities upstream to hopefully maintain existing conditions where they're at, so that the project effectiveness doesn't diminish over time.
okay, bottom line question was, is there a prediction that flooding will occur more often now? That's what I understand. Is that right?
In the Midwest, broadly speaking, with climate change, yes.
Okay. So the matter becomes more and more pressing. And so it's really important. I mean, to me, that's the big, and I've said this to the council, the big elephant in the room is this devastation for flooding.
Right.
And in my opinion, the council can't wait on this. There needs to be a plan and needs to be started yesterday. That's one person's opinion.
So can I ask two questions before?
Sure.
And one of them might be more Dalton than you, so.
Okay.
The first one, I'm not exactly sure what it's called, it's the rain barrel process, that we give money back for purchasing that, and would that be something that the city would be able to give grants for, like the wall that we saw, the flooding wall? Would that fall into that category?
Yeah, we could certainly, we could expand that program to cover that kind of thing, but like, we've talked about this, John and I have, the rain barrels are, you can fill a rain barrel up off one downspout in like 10 minutes, so it helps, but not substantially. Same with like the soil quality restorations, if everyone in town did a soil quality, with the compost road projects that Julie did up by you, if everyone in town did that, there might be a measurable, huge impact, but it's just incremental, to the tune of $10,000 a year incremental improvements. Did that answer your question?
Yes. And then the second one is, I know that you had talked kind of like Levee A was probably one of the ones that you might recommend, kind of reading through things here. Would that, if we would go with that, would that reduce the amount of payment that our residents would be shelling out for flood insurance? Or how does that work? Because looking at the colors, I'm not too sure.
Yeah, so very good question. That was related to the comment I made about levy accreditation versus a non-accredited levy. So FEMA requires certain criteria to be met to be accredited. The accreditation the main thing it does is it takes the floodplain off the map for the area behind the levee. So levee alignment A, as it currently stands, would not be accredited. That's purely based on the tie-in elevations and the top elevations in between these two locations. There might be a way to massage things, or, you know, if Polk County and Clive end up putting in some upstream storage that drops the water surface even half a foot to a foot, it may become accreditable. But with the best available data we have right now, that's the way we looked at it. And to get to answer your question, there would be no, it would not have a benefit to flood insurance the way we've represented it here. As you can tell, that's a nuanced discussion, and I think if you actually went down that path and went to look at design, there'd be some ongoing discussion, basically, how can you get it to that point and get the same benefits at the lowest cost. But as it is right now, the benefits would be flood damage reduction avoidance, not floodplain map and flood insurance cost avoidance.
Didn't know if we would be able to kind of accomplish more than one, you know, kind of sandwich everything together, but thank you.
I have a question for somebody. Please, go ahead.
I was just gonna be clear, just to be, you mentioned sandwich them together. I mean, that was the intent of B, right, is to look at that alternative where flood insurance would be a benefit.
I was just looking at the costs for what we would be shelling out versus for A and B, you know, there's a difference there, so I was hoping maybe we could slide that on in.
Okay.
Well, and we also did consider, but I didn't actually model yet a scenario where perhaps a more modest channel improvement plus levee alignment A could actually achieve the objective that you're suggesting. For the most part, we consider these improvements individually for benefit cost analysis, but there might be a sweet spot where they could be combined. So.
Thank you.
Very good, thank you. How long has the NFIP program been around?
1968.
1968. So would there, maybe, probably not a question for you, but Dennis or Dalton, why have we not been a part of it thus far?
So
Are there certain requirements?
there's two parts. So you're in the National Flood Insurance Program. You do participate in that now. So that provides flood insurance availability to the community. It's the CRS program as an added thing. That started in the 90s, I believe. And there are only a handful of communities in the state that actually participate right now, but several of them are in the metro. Clive does, I believe Urbandale and West Des Moines do as well.
So are there certain requirements or parameters we have to qualify for to get us there?
Yeah, so it's a class system, starts with class 9 and goes down to 1. Each increment is 500 points, and there's a whole big like tax code manual that tells you how you get those points. A lot of them, most communities, come in at like a 9 or an 8 or a 7, and they just get credit for the things that they're doing already.
Okay.
So some of these stormwater management efforts that you're doing in the wider area, just your regular stormwater maintenance, doing a little bit of extra outreach here and there about floodplain management, flood insurance, those are the ways that you would end up getting those points. And so you just, the process to apply is really just talking to the Iowa DNR and saying, hey, we want to apply for CRS, and can you, it's part of their role to help communities get that process started. And then they would help, they plus the NFIP CRS contractor would kind of help define what are the things that are most likely to get you points.
Have we initiated that, Dennis?
No, sir, we're waiting for the council to make a determination on which priorities they want to pursue. However, in John and Dan's report, this has kind of been quantified as a low-hanging fruit and easy to implement. So whether or not, I mean, if we went another year without making any determination on a strategy for flood mitigation, we would be pursuing this regardless.
hope we get onto it right away, but the whole thing, you know, it's not gonna happen tomorrow, but it's going to happen over time. But there's gotta be a start time of dealing with this, and so,
And I would argue that the start time happened when we signed up JEO to do this flood mitigation.
well, that's part of planning.
Yes.
Yes, when the actual implementation happens.
Right.
But, and I do recall, we had some discussions on it with Dalton very early in the process, and correct me if I'm stating it incorrectly, but I think the thought process was, you know, for some communities, it maybe doesn't make fiscal sense to do the community rating system just because they don't have enough policy coverage, or, you know, they're not getting the right number of points. So they wanted to get a feel for what that was gonna look like before making a decision. So I'm gonna move forward and get to the handouts you have. And Dan is also gonna hand out some additional material. I mentioned earlier, well, we talked to the Public Works Committee on November 3rd. Prior to that, we had a public meeting where we presented these recommendations on October 20th. And we did get some public feedback. And it was, I mean, just to be honest, it was a little bit mixed. But the general trend was people were more interested in real-world flood risk reduction versus floodplain map reduction benefits. And the things that we recommended as being priorities, such as the community rating system, stormwater management, and to a lesser extent, channel modification, were looked at as priorities through that process too. When we talked to the Public Works Committee, we went through all the same material, and those projects I mentioned, and that are reflected on the table there, as being looked at in more detail for cost-benefit analysis, are the ones that are marked as high on the pre-BCA column, so that's the yellow ones on the left. And then where we ended up is the yellow entries on the right, based on that BCA. So they, after that discussion, it was recommended to look at Levee Alignment A, channel modification, and then two different variations on the North Walnut Creek structure flood risk reduction, which is the flood wall and the retrofitting. The two programmatic recommendations, really kind of the benefit cost analysis for CRS was already done. Stormwater management doesn't really have one, so we still recommend those, but there's just not extra effort put into those. Sorry, I'm just waiting for that to load up for me there. This is the summary table showing all the actions. And you can see, some of you saw this before in the Public Works Committee meeting, but one thing that we've added is the benefit cost ratio. I think that actually made it worse, but some benefit cost. So what we've got on here is priority and timeline and the benefit cost ratio findings for the projects that we looked at that for. And the key takeaway from the way it looked before is this North Walnut Creek flood wall was not cost effective due to the cost side of the equation, but retrofitting those structures, a lot of those structures have a lot of benefits on a per structure basis because they're flooded in a relatively frequent event potentially. And then we also elevated the channel modification to high priority and took Levee Alignment A down to moderate priority. And I'm going to talk a little bit more here about why we did that. So the channel modification with the businesses on the 3E side of the channel, and the wider benefit area there, there's just a lot more benefits to that project, even though the costs are higher. And we think that, obviously your discretion, but our recommendation is to look at, I'm gonna scroll through this a little bit. This FEMA Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program has through what's called BRIC, or Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, has a subcategory that's in the state set-aside, so it's not, that funding has a state set-aside and a nationally competitive component. All this stuff that Dan's gonna pass out here has to do with that. It's just information about that program. I'm gonna talk about the synopsis, and then these are the fact sheets, so this isn't the totally put you to sleep at night stuff. And Dan, if we grab some copies for Dalton too. But this program has what's called a project scoping category. The purpose of that category is to take a project like the channel project and to drill down more deeply into the specifics of it. And it allows you the opportunity to do things like build partnerships with neighboring communities, complete more in-depth benefit cost analysis, do preliminary design, try to arrange the channel opportunity into, at a national level, FEMA's big into nature-based solutions, so floodplain restoration. That's also a category of work that may be fundable in terms of cost share assistance from other agencies, urban conservation grants, those types of funding sources. And so, this is something that, it's kind of a new piece of information. We haven't even had a chance to talk with Dalton about this yet. But, in terms of next steps moving forward, if you want to look at the channel, we think it just has, we're not necessarily saying the channel is better than the levee in like a general sense, but we just think there's more opportunity to design that to bring more benefits into the equation, to make it more of a community amenity, part of the greenbelt thought process. But part of a good portion of the channel projects is actually in less than one jurisdiction. So there's a lot of conversations and elements that need to be coordinated there to take that to the next step. And the BRIC project scoping opportunity is just one potential way to do that. There are other ways. But like I said, that opportunity is part of the state set-aside for the state with that BRIC money. If you pursue it and get it and complete a project and then develop a project that actually is gonna be submitted to FEMA for funding for the project to be built, you get extra points if it comes out of a project scoping effort. So, just something to consider there.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
I'm just a simple Italian young man. If we look at the structural thing, are those priorities S1, S2, S3? Is that how those are listed?
So the project ID is not a prioritization. It's just a number. They're not in rank order.
Okay. I guess I'd like to see that from the consultants. It's, Public Works did rate them.
Sure.
Prior, I was a part of that. But you guys are the experts in this whole thing. And so, at least I do, and I don't know about Dalton or anybody else here, but since you're hired as the experts, I would like to see your priorities in terms of what would be the best, would get the most bang for the buck, and that has the greatest need. So that's what I'd like to see, and I guess I don't see it in here. I see a lot of things, but where do you start?
So we actually did do that, but not in exactly way that you're suggesting, and we certainly can do it that way. The bottom line priority projects that we identified are the ones that you see here. So basically the programmatic recommendations, and out of the structural, the channel, and out of the non-structural retrofitting for the structures at North Walnut Creek. We also did provide that in a different way in this, what we can do is we can just essentially add more emphasis to the tabular summary and to this figure regarding which items are recommended to move forward. And the timeline component of when is really included here.
Okay, but I still don't understand the priorities that you would think would give us the most bang for the buck and where we should start.
So,
Because I still don't know where we would suggest where we start.
Well, I think he's giving us options here to.
Yeah, I know he's giving us
Then we
options.
have to decide. I
Well,
think that's
do
what,
I
right?
guess I'm not an expert on this, so that's why I'm asking the experts.
sure, well, I would definitely tell you, so stormwater management effort is an ongoing thing.
Right.
Well, and I should say that one thing that's a little bit hard to capture, aside from just saying it, is when upstream storage opportunities come, there might be a perfect one that you latch onto, and then all this changes, because
Well, yeah, that's fine.
because it's just the perfect one.
Yeah.
So right now, that's kind of an asterisk. Stormwater management's ongoing. Community rating system, I think you should join that and start that process as you suggested. And the channel modifications, I think that you should apply for the brick project scoping grant so that you can take that to the next level with the intent that it defines for sure whether there's a cost beneficial version of this that can be produced through a more detailed preliminary design type effort and just taking it to the next level of detail on that particular project. Likewise with the North Walnut Creek structure retrofitting, that can be started any time, and then that's kind of more to the, what's your priority, where do you wanna put your money and effort? Those things can be run in parallel. I think the big question that, the other thing that you need to answer for yourselves is, my take is that it's better for the park to be left open to allow floodwaters to enter and exit, rather than put a levee system in there. But certainly, if the community wants to pursue a levee system rather than the channel or both, or, some sequence of those, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, I think the channel opportunity is a better one, and it provides you more flexibility.
And you're starting to give me the answer that I want to hear now. Because you've got to start somewhere, and what I'm hearing you say are the channels right now. And so I respect that, because that's why we hired you to do this job. So I'm glad to hear you say that, because I hadn't heard that exactly before. Maybe I have, and I've just been not a good listener.
So, one of the things that we did between the Public Works Committee meeting and now, and the public meeting and now, is we did that benefit cost analysis and reviewed some of the funding opportunities. And so my answer today is based on that review.
Yeah, that's great, yeah. I think that's where it started.
Dan or Chris, did you have anything to add there?
I think your comment about the impact on the park needs to be evaluated, let alone, on just being volume, impact with the levy, no levy, and the impact on the 3E property as well. So I think that was well put. Those are all considerations.
Yeah, I'd say, and I appreciate the comment, we can be more clear. One of the ways we approach these, there's obviously sensitivities with all these projects. Some of these affect
Sure, yeah.
individual landowners, some of them affect,
It's a big problem.
not only is there a lot of benefits, but there's people that are going to be impacted,
Sure.
if you're gonna build something. And so, we take the approach of finding opportunities things that could work, and that's where John mentioned, we had done that analysis up to the point of the public meeting and the Public Works Committee, and then we've done that more detailed analysis. So if I could summarize it maybe just slightly different, I'd say our analysis to date shows there is promise in structural alternatives. Probably more channel than levee. I think a combination of both it might be where it ends up. But I think where we ended up now is it's beneficial to move forward, so much so that I think there's benefit in submitting an application to do a more detailed project analysis, more detailed. Call her right now concept level. I think the next step would be to go to the 30% design, more detailed benefit cost analysis level. And the good thing is you guys can actually get a pretty decent grant to actually do that. I mean, to the tune of, one of the projects we're working on is they've got $800,000 to do some of that type of stuff. So it's not small money that they're putting towards some of this
But you're
mitigation.
starting to add more specificity now,
Mhm.
which I appreciate.
Yeah.
And, you talk about the big picture, but it's a very complex picture. And so I appreciate what you're both saying now, for getting down to kind of my level. And so I think that's what I want to do at least.
Sure, and at the end of this, if there's any ambiguity or anything we can tie up, please let us know, because we don't want to be done with this and then
I
have
think
it.
you're going to it right now, exactly.
Okay.
That's, I guess, the question, if you really narrowing in on that.
And the last thing I would say on that is that, both the levee and the channel have potential in terms of flood risk reduction. The channel corridor in that region, I think, has a lot more potential as a community amenity, extension of the green belt, other elements that might garner not only more benefits for the project, but more funding potential as well.
Good to know.
Do we know what, so you talked about where that needs to really be done in concert or in conjunction with other communities. So do we know if that is consistent with Clive and what they've got in their plan, Dalton? I mean, does it complement what they've got going on, so it's not counterproductive? I guess I wanna make sure that that's been a consideration.
Yeah, yep, and Clive's been very involved in this throughout, so.
Okay,
John and his team actually coordinated 100 times at least with the Silver Jackets folks to make sure we weren't doing work in conflict with each other.
okay. I just wanted to make sure that was consistent.
And we did, on that point, we did also look with our flood modeling, is this project gonna cause impacts upstream or downstream?
Okay, good.
With the levee project, it does. With the channel project, there's a very, very small, like less than 1/10 of a foot downstream impact. That can be mitigated with the design process. I will also say that, Clive's general program for flood risk reduction, they are focusing more on non-structural. They're doing acquisitions, potential retrofitting in the future. But the character of and they have actually also looked at a channel project. I'm not quite up to speed with whether they're gonna pursue that or not.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dalton.
Council, any other questions?
So you did say that, because I was gonna ask about the, what the channeling would do to downstream and if it would even have any effect upstream. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but you said that wouldn't, it would have just a small amount.
Yeah, pretty much no, and the reason no is it's just taking the same water and
Lowering it.
widening and lowering it. The reason for the difference is most likely, in the weeds of the technical information. But that's where I said with an actual channel design, it could be designed to prevent that impact from occurring.
And so we're being kind to our neighbors as we are doing this, with the exception of probably the levee, if what I kind of understood is correct. And then how would we go about figuring out what we would cost to other cities if we decided to go with the levee program? Is that something that we have to look at? Are we talking with other cities? How does that kind of work?
So, the levee alternative, I can actually show you some of this information it is in the story map. So these stars here show you what at least in this immediate vicinity, what the elevation change is. And so it's not a huge impact, but it's a few tenths of flooding increase for 3E with levee alignment A or B. So those impacts are pretty localized, so right in this area and just upstream. And the way levee alignment C prevents those impacts from occurring, but that's because it still allows the park to flood. So from a floodplain management sense, when the impacts like that occur, generally speaking, you have to basically coordinate compensation for the impacts with the impacted property owner. So that cost is not explicitly included in our evaluation at this point.
I have clarity, at least in my own mind, of what you're saying.
Any further questions? Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, could I
Yeah.
just offer some clarification at the end, because I just don't think like everybody else, I have to kind of close some doors in my head. And Mr. Lafredo just said he has clarity now, so I'm worried that I'm risking
You ought to be,
sending this
because
off. Sure.
Well,
I just want to be sure, because when you get into a very technical discussion about things, sometimes it sounds like you're saying the opposite of what you're saying. And so I just want to make sure, just for purposes here, that your recommendation is to allow the park to flood as a deliberate strategy for prevention and remediation of flooding.
Yeah, so within the floodplain, the park, and you can kind of get a sense of it if you just go down there and stand there by the community center. The park is the historical floodplain. So in terms of just the park itself, so I kind of, in my mind, I divide the park from the neighborhood by the park. In the park, flooding is good. Flooding in the neighborhood that impacts the structures is what we want to avoid. Now, obviously there is infrastructure in the park, and the channel for the, it's the Public Works building and the community center are fairly elevated. The channel reduces the risk for those buildings, as does the levee, as does individual building retrofitting options. So there's 3 different ways that you could get to that. But the channel, broadly speaking, reduces risk for many other buildings as well. The other infrastructure such as the, playgrounds, courts, the performance pavilion, small things could be done there, submersible electrical components could be installed to basically make those more robust and easier to clean up after a flood event. But the park has value in the flood storage to prevent flooding elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. And then on the theme of prioritization, I just want to reiterate that JEO is recommending pursuit because of the cost-benefit analysis on the channel project versus the levee project at this point. And it's reflected in your prioritization on the very right column. So your levee
Yes.
A is now a moderate priority. Now, for the purposes of the council's future discussion about this, is there some clarification you can give to us on the projects that you've identified as moderate and why they didn't rise to the level of the higher priority ones? And what I mean is, if there's a council member who maybe is on the fence or doesn't understand why this one is higher than that one, is there something that was in your mind that put it in this column versus that column, or is there something different that could be done or a different way of looking at it that could elevate it to a higher priority project?
Yeah, good question. So, at least specifically with the levee, just to reiterate what you said, is the reasoning was cost-benefit based, floodplain map benefit based, not reaching that accreditation status, so that maybe would tip the scales, from moderate to high. impacts were considered. Channel causes comparatively fewer impacts. And sort of the general answer about moderate is that the levee still provides beneficial flood risk reduction. It just isn't enough,
To
in my
justify the
opinion,
cost.
to justify it being in a high category. One thing that's a little bit abstract is that, in particular with the Covey Park neighborhood, you've got a lot of stuff, a lot of buildings in the floodplain, but the relative risk is low because most of those buildings, a lot of them are slab on grade, or, you know, they have a couple steps, and so the actual risk of getting water in on a building by building basis is fairly infrequent. Whereas the opposite is true for the North Walnut Creek structures because of the way they're built. And so that, again, with the channel versus the levee, the channel reduces risk more broadly to more buildings, and so that accumulates more value. Whereas the levee, with it reducing risk just for those sets of buildings in the Covey Park neighborhood, just the monetary value is high because they're not at that high of a flood risk, even though they're in the floodplain.
Okay, thank you. And then my last question, and this is a little bit off the topic, but I was talking with a citizen about this some time ago, and the comment was made, well, why are we putting together a plan or a strategy to deal with a 100-year flood event when most of us won't be around at that point, and maybe the community center might not even be there? Why aren't we targeting, say, the 20-year or the 30-year flood event, and in investing our money there to protect our infrastructure when those happen more frequently than that one flood event, catastrophic flood event? I'm not diminishing its impact, but where you would place your dollars. So I think there's some misunderstanding and misconceptions in there. Could you just speak to that maybe for 2 minutes? And
Sure. And I'm gonna show a figure that supports my explanation. So if you look closely at this one, what you see there in the lighter blue is the 10-year flood. So a lot of these areas we're talking about flood relatively frequently, and actually the floods that you've experienced, 2015, 18, those are around this magnitude of flood. So this, and when we use that, it's the worst foundational terminology ever we could have had in floodplain. 10-year, basically, what it truly means is 10% annual chance. 100-year means 1% annual chance. So the channel project and the levee project actually both mitigate risk for these more frequent flood events as well. And in fact, that's one of the reasons the channel project has more value, is because it reduces the frequency of flooding for those more frequent flood events to all the buildings that are at risk in this region. It's, in other words, its benefit, its flood height reduction benefit is more for the more frequent flood events than it is the 1% annual chance or 100-year flood event. That's also the same reason that those North Walnut Creek structures that we looked at, the retrofitting is so valuable, is because their flood risk is 10-year flood for many of them.
I mean, the flood that we had, Dave, what, 3 years ago or so?
15 and 18,
Huh? Okay, well, must have been.
both of them were both about the same.
But you know, it creates havoc.
Right.
And, even though it's, what do we call it, a 20-year one or 10-year one.
So just to add further to that, to answer your question, I mean, we did analyze all that stuff. So in these benefit cost analyses that we did, what's the 2-year, is that where it started, 2-year through the 500-year. So all those frequency of flooding and then the capacity or the peak discharge of those floods, those have all been evaluated and accounted for in this benefit cost analysis. And to your point, that is an option, you know, a lot of people associate levies with a 100-year levy or a 1% annual chance levy. There's a lot of levies out there that are 10-year levies. So maybe to the discussion that's been had, maybe it's a combination of a channel modification that can hold a 100-year discharge or 1% discharge, I do it myself, coupled with a 10-year levy or a 10% levy. So there's all kinds of different combinations of scenarios that could work out, both for a bottom line desire that you guys might have. Maybe there's a particular elevation set that benefits a particular part of the park or a particular building or something like that. That maybe doesn't meet benefit costs, or maybe it does, but there's kind of your desires that play into that too.
Well, you've gotta look at it too, a 20-year flood or even a 10-year flood. Tell somebody who has their home all water in the basement is basically $20,000 worth of damage. And so the one prior to that, Dave, I mean, it was really washing through, it came down really fast.
That was the 18.
Okay, and I mean, we had a lot of property damage then. I don't know what that was, a 20-year one or whatever it was. But depends if it's your house or your business.
Yeah, I think I've heard it said something like, the guy who's got a foot of water in his house doesn't care what the frequency of the event was.
Exactly.
One other comment related to that is that we did find in some of the public feedback we got, and just looking at the flood risk profile data, this area where North Walnut Creek and Walnut Creek have their confluence is a high-risk area in general. And I think a lot of the impacts that, maybe not all, but some of the impacts that we heard about were in this area. One other thing is that I think that historically there have been some places that have been impacted by localized heavy rainfall flooding in the storm drain system as well. And, that person might be in the floodplain, but the impact wasn't from the floodplain, it was from the direct rainfall. So we did not look at that aspect, so depending on the individual property owner circumstances, that could be a consideration.
Any other questions? Ben?
No, sir.
Thank you.
Good discussion.
Motion to accept the,
Hold on, what is that? What have you shown us? Yeah.
This is, this is what's called a story map.
Okay.
And our reporting for the project is encapsulated in the story map.
Can we have it?
Yes, well, it's publicly online right now.
Okay. Do we have the link?
Is there a link on the website still? Yeah, there's a flood plan section of the Windsor Heights website where the link is. We will be providing, I guess, summary technical memo and some appendices of the technical data to Dawn to use as well.
Okay.
okay, motion to accept the flood study by JEO Consulting and set the work session to January 18th.
So moved.
Roll call.
Susan Skiris?
Yes.
Joseph Jones?
Yes.
Mike LaFredo?
Yes.
Ken Jones?
Yes.
Next item is consideration of resolution 2021-45, updating the guidelines, policies, and fees for the Windsor Heights Community Center.
So moved.
Second.
Roll call. Any discussion on it?
I have a question.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
So on the updated version, page 1, or page 25, so the cancellations, refunds are only granted under the extenuating circumstances after approval by the city administrator. Would that be the city administrator or the city council? Because, like, the city council had to say, yes, we approve, the COVID stuff. Is that something that would be brought to us, or is that sticking with you for?
It's however the council wants to run it, of course. We thought this would be the most expedited way to do it, because during COVID, this is the way we ran it. If somebody needed a refund, they would come and ask me for permission for that refund under the council's direction for the COVID relief. So we thought that worked very well. There weren't any discrepancies. And the reason I also like that kind of a setup is because it also keeps the council as kind of an appeal body. So if somebody doesn't like the city administrator's answer, they can always refer that or ask that of the council to override that. So we thought that was a good step too in between and save some bureaucracy process.
Didn't you bring those requests for refunds to council anyway?
Every month we had, or we extended it, like,
From a policy
From a-
perspective,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
so we didn't get it individually, but
Right,
we blanket covered it
right,
for COVID.
right.
If that's the intent, should that be in there then? As far as the appeal process goes to the council?
We should have a written policy and procedure for that request, yes.
Do we currently have one or no?
No, we would put that together for you to bless and say this is the way we want things to operate. I always like to say yes or no to somebody and say, it's the council told me to do it that way, so this is the way we gotta do it.
Or do they directly do that?
Right.
Simple person. Dictatorship is much easier than democracy is.
Any further discussion? Roll call.
Susan Skiris,
Yes.
Joseph Jones,
Yes.
Mike LaFredo.
Yes.
Mike Jones.
Yes.
Next item is consideration resolution 2021-46, updating the community center retainage percentage for improvements. Motion to approve.
Second,
Discussion?
thank you for putting that together for us.
Roll call.
Susan Skiris.
Yes.
Joseph Jones,
Yes.
Mike LaFredo,
Yes.
Mike Jones.
Yes.
Next item is consideration resolution 2021-47, approving an updated fee schedule for the city of Windsor Heights.
So moved.
Second.
Discussion. Hearing none, roll call.
Susan Skiris,
Yes.
Joseph Jones.
Yes.
Mike LaFredo.
Yes.
And Mike Jones.
Yes.
Consideration resolution 2021-48, resolution setting a time and a place for a public hearing on ordinance 2021-06, amending chapter 3.02, voting precincts.
So moved.
Time and the place is 12:20.
Second.
Moved.
Any discussion?
So is this new? Do we,
No, it's not new. We basically, our ordinance, at some point between now and 10 years ago, we went from 3 wards to 2, and our ordinance book wasn't updated. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna have a hearing and then actually pass the entire ordinance at that November 20th meeting, or not November, December 20th meeting.
Which is two places.
2 precincts,
Yeah.
what we have now. So we're basically correcting the ordinance so we can put the corrected ordinance with the precinct map and then send that to the
That's what
county.
I thought.
Yeah, so that's all that is.
so we were just a little behind the times.
It just, something got missed.
Okay.
Few years.
Roll call.
Susan Skiris,
Yes.
Joseph Jones,
Yes.
Mike LaFredo,
Yes.
Mike Jones,
Yes.
and Teresa Harms. This was on the setting the public hearing for the ordinance
Yes.
amendment. Okay.
Thank you, my apologies.
Item F is consideration resolution 2021-49, setting a public hearing on voting precinct maps. That public hearing will also be on 12/20.
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? Roll call.
Susan Skiris,
Yes.
Joseph Jones,
Yes.
Mike LaFredo,
Yes.
Mike Jones,
Yes.
and Teresa Harms.
Yes.
Next item is consideration of 2022 health and benefit renewal.
Move to approve.
Second.
Any discussion? Roll call.
Oh,
Well,
I was
excuse
just gonna
me.
say, no, I really appreciate, how things were outlined and the additional information about how you got to your answer. I know in the past, the, budget committee had considered those. I don't know if the budget committee was part of the conversation or not, so, okay, great. And then, but I appreciate the additional information and background, because we haven't always gotten that in the past, so I just wanted to say kudos to the team for, providing that information, so thank you.
Any further comments or discussion?
So we will be saving 6%?
Yeah, rough, depending on the census, like I said, I know that, you know, if things change, like the marriage or kids or, you know, that sort of thing, so. But yeah, depending on our current census, that's what we'll say.
Roll call.
Susan Skiris.
Yes.
Joseph Jones.
Yes.
Mike LaFredo.
Yes.
Mike Jones.
Yes.
And Teresa Harms.
Yes.
Next item is consideration of pay request number 16, College Drive Improvement Projects.
Move to approve.
Second.
Discussion? Hearing none, roll call.
Susan Skiris.
Yes.
Joseph Jones.
Yes.
Mike LaFredo.
Yes.
Mike Jones.
Yes.
And Teresa Harms.
Yes.
Next item is consideration of pay request 17, 2020 Street Improvements Project, 69th and Allison. Motion?
Oh, move to approve.
Sorry.
Second?
Did you get a second, Travis?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. Any discussion? Roll call.
Susan Skiris.
Yes.
Joseph Jones.
Yes.
Mike LaFredo.
Yes.
Mike Jones.
Yes.
And Teresa Harms.
Yes.
Next item, reports, Teresa.
Sure, the meeting meets again on Tuesday the 14th, so just an FYI that, public safety is scheduled for the 16th. And so, we have a few agenda items that we'll be covering as well. A huge thank you to all the volunteers and folks that came and participated in Windsor Wonderland, which was held at Ivy on Saturday from 9 to noon. And the special events committee and the chamber and Lauren and Michael and everybody else that came out. I think it was a huge success. And again, we had lots of great volunteers from the community, and I think it got people energized. So I look forward to continuing to build on that for the coming year. And then I just wanted to note, and not to get anybody excited, but I know there's a register article that Mr. Jones participated in this last week about his new role as mayor. And there was some concerns that I received from folks about the shared services comments. And so I just wanted to, I hope that as we have a new council and new leadership, that we can continue to work as a team and not get everybody all in an uproar, and that we can have conversations about these things as we move forward. So, thank you.
Mike?
Bravo last week discussed the brainstorm for the strategic plan. Tomorrow, communications committee meeting, and I think Thursday, we have Public Works, is that right? To discuss the draft CIP.
Michael?
Mike, I'm glad you brought that up in the newspaper article, because it's easily addressed. Whether it be done in the register or not is another question. But I want to take a couple minutes to thank Dave for his service as mayor these past 4 years. Thank you very much, sir. And Mike Jones, congratulations for his election as the mayor. So I talked to the other two people in the audience last time, and you got a lot of work to do, and all I can say is, I'll be watching. So,
Are you not gonna be
Is that
here?
a threat or a promise?
I might be on occasion, John Thompson and I may be here, somewhere in the afternoon,
Okay.
so,
Joseph?
Are you done now?
yes, sir.
I wasn't sure. Let the record show that Mr. LaFredo mentioned everyone else who ran except for me.
You weren't here last week, because I got the council last time, you were absent.
We had a DART meeting since our last meeting. We have another one tomorrow. Biggest thing kind of right now is the fact that we're still low on drivers. So if you know anybody who has a CDL and who needs a job or a side job, we're looking for full-time and part-time drivers in our metro.
I can do part-time.
Here you go, look at there. Continue your service, Mike.
Could you give me a recommendation? Reckless driving.
We'll get you a smaller one.
You can't say that in open meetings.
What?
You can't say that in open meeting.
Susan?
I was able to attend the Metro Waste Recycling Facility ribbon cutting on November 17th. Thank you, Mayor Burgess, for attending the event. There were a lot of local and state elected officials that attended, as this was a really big advance for the Metro Waste. I believe this has been in the planning and then building stages for for a total of about 5 years now. So the tour of the facility was very interesting and very educational, and I just happened to coast in on the tale of what Therese did, and, you know, it was nice to see everything work out the way it did. Then on the 30th, I attended the dedication and ribbon cutting at Clive's new public safety building there on Hickman.
It's nice.
It's a state-of-the-art facility, and it was amazing to walk through, kind of makes you jealous. I was given a tour by Lieutenant Foreman, who also works for Windsor Heights here. He gave me a tour of the fire department, and then, amazingly enough, Chief Rowe, who's the fire chief, gave me a tour of the police department. Not sure how
It's
that works.
called cross-working together.
And he did a very good job on his tour. So thank you to Chief McCluskey, the fire department on-duty staff, Mayor Burgess, and City Administrator Durham for attending the dedication. I know that meant a lot to Clive to have us there. As Therese said, Windsor Wonderland was a great event, I'm told. I'm bummed I wasn't there, but I'm happy that it went off without a hitch. As Mike said, communications committee meeting on Tuesday. Then on Wednesday, I have a Metro Waste audit team meeting. And I'm gonna plug this again, Elf movie on the 17th. So movie starts at 7 p.m. Make sure to get there early for your drinks, pizza, popcorn, cookies, and whatever else.
And
may be
you're
there.
substituting for me. For the public works.
Oh, I didn't know that I hadn't received a response back from anything, so I didn't know.
Bye.
I wanted to do a few follow-up questions. I did see right before I left, something that I was gonna talk about and ask where we were with the AV equipment, but I see that we're gonna be talking about that at tomorrow's communication meeting. When I quick skimmed the email, I did notice that there's a significant difference between with the quotes between the first one that was provided to council to approve back in summer and the other two quotes that were received. There's about a $10,000 and an $8,000 difference between the quotes that we received, between the first one and these quotes. I think it just kind of proves the importance of city staff receiving quotes from more than just one vendor, even if that is who we have done business with prior. We're spending taxpayer dollars, and due diligence should be done prior to presenting items to council. My next question is, when will we be having a discussion on the punch list for University Avenue? On the November 1st city council meeting, I brought this issue up during my council comments. Dennis said we could have this discussion during a work session at the next meeting, which would have been November 15th. I asked if Mike Jones wanted to be present for this conversation, or if we could have it without him, since he was going to be gone for that meeting. Dennis stated we could have this discussion at the work session during what would be today's council meeting. I thought we were supposed to have it on November 15th, but when that didn't happen, I assumed I misunderstood what was said. Obviously, we aren't talking about the university punch list today, so just wondering when we are going to be having this discussion. And that's it.
Thank you. Dennis, you got any follow-up comments? No, sir. Okay. Motion to adjourn to the work session.
Got it.
Roll call.
Susan Skiris,
Yes.
Joseph Jones.
Yes.
Mike LaFredo,
Yeah.
Mike Jones, and Teresa Harms.
Yes.